Greetings and welcome to Classics Cut for July 2024. Myself and my fellow away team member, Mr. Robert Tobias, are going to read you a wonderful selection today for this month's performance for Independence Day. As you know, we have three members normally. Our current member, Mr. Mike Breen, could not be here today, so we will carry on awaying in his stead. And as you know, always, if you need or would like to submit requests for us to read for material, please come to the away team at mccpl.lib.al.us. We are accepting nominations for reading for next year, so please get those into us. So, for Independence Day, for Independence Month, the birthday of America, we are reading David McCullough's wonderful book, 1776. His somewhat fictitious, but very factual personification of the American Revolution. So, friends, enjoy as myself and Mr. Tobias will endeavor to thrill you.
Chapter 1, Sovereign Duty. On the afternoon of Thursday, October 26, 1775, His Royal Majesty George III, King of England, rode in royal splendor from St. James's Place to the Palace of Westminster, there to address the opening of Parliament on the increasingly distressing issue of war in America. The day was cool, but clear skies and sunshine, a rarity in London, brightened everything, and the royal cavalcade, spruced and polished, shone to perfection. In an age that had given England such rousing patriotic songs as God Save the King and Rule of Britannia, in a nation that adored ritual and glorious pageantry, it was seen hardly to be improved upon. An estimated 60,000 people had turned out. They lined the whole route through St. James's Park. At Westminster, people were packed solid, many having stood since morning, hoping for a glimpse of the King or some other notables of Parliament. So great was the crush, the latecomers had difficulty seeing much of anything. One of the many Americans then in London, a Massachusetts loyalist named Samuel Cohen, found the mob outside the door on the House of Lords too much to bear and returned to his lodgings. It was his second failed attempt to see the King. The time before, His Majesty had been passing by in a sedan chair near St. James, but reading a newspaper so close to his face that only one hand was showing. The whitest hand mine eyes ever beheld, with a very large rose diamond ring, Loyalist Cohen recorded. The King's procession departed St. James at 2 o'clock, proceeding at a walking speed. By tradition, 2 horse grenadiers with swords drawn rode in the lead to clear the way, followed by gleaming coaches filled with nobility. Then a clattering horse guards, the yeomen of guard in red and gold livery, and a rank footman, also in red and gold. Finally came the King in his colossal golden chariot, pulled by 8 magnificent cream-colored horses, a single postilion riding left beside the horse, and 6 footmen at each side. No mortal on earth rode in such style as the King. The English knew it. 24 feet in length and 13 feet high, the royal coach weighed nearly 4 tons, enough to make the ground tremble under way. George III had it built years before, insisting it be superb. 3 gilded cherubs on top, symbols of England, Scotland, and Ireland, held high a gilded crown, while over the heavy spoked wheels, front and back, loomed 4 gilded sea gods, formidable reminders that Britannia ruled the waves. Allegorical scenes on the door panels celebrate the nation's heritage, and windows were sufficient in size to provide full view of the crowd sovereign within. It was as though the very grandeur, wealth, and weight of the British Empire was rolling past. An empire that by now included Canada, and that reached from the seaboard of Massachusetts and Virginia to the Mississippi and beyond, from Caribbean to shores to Bengal. London, its population at nearly 1 million souls, was the largest city in Europe and widely considered the capital of the world. George III had been 22 when, in 1760, he succeeded to the throne, To a remarkable degree, he remained a man of simple taste and few presentations. He liked plain food and drank but little, and wine only. Defying fashion, he refused to wear a wig. That the palace and St. James had been a bit dowdy bothered him not at all. He rather liked it in a way. Socially awkward at court occasions, many found him disappointingly dull. He preferred puttering about his farms at Windsor, dressed in farmer's clothes, and noble contrast to much of fashionable society at court, where mistresses and infidelities were not only accepted part of life, but often flaunted. The king remained steadfastly faithful to his very plain queen, the German princess Charlotte Sophia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, with whom by now he had produced 10 children. Ultimately, there would be 15. Gossips claimed Farmer George's chief pleasure were a leg of mutton and his plain little wife. But this was hardly fair, nor was he the unattractive, dim-witted man critics claimed then and afterwards. Tall and rather handsome, with clear blue eyes and generally cheerful expression, George III had a genuine love of music and played both the violin and piano. His favorite composer was Handel, but he also adored the music of Bach in 1764, had taken such tremendous delight in hearing the boy Mozart perform the organ. He loved architecture and did quite beautiful architectural drawings of his own. With a good eye for art, he had begun early to assemble his own collection, which by now included works from the contemporary Italian painter Calento, as well as watercolors and drawings from such old masters as Poussin and Raphael. He avidly collected books to the point where he had assembled one of the finest libraries in the world. He adored clocks, ship models, took great interest in things practical, took great interest in astronomy, and founded the Royal Academy of the Arts. He also had a gift for putting people at their ease. Samuel Johnson, the era's reigning arbiter of all things of the mind, and no easy judge of men, responded warmly to the unaffected good nature of George III. They had met and conversed for the first time when Johnson visited the King's Library, after which Johnson remarked to the librarian, "Sir, they may talk of the king as they will, but he is the finest gentleman I have ever seen." Stories had been slow to learn that by age 11 he still could not read were unfounded. The strange behavior, the so-called madness of King George III, for which he would be long remembered, did not come until much later, more than 25 years later. Rather than mental illness, it appears to have been porphyria, a hereditary disease not diagnosed until the 20th century. Still youthful at 37, and still hard-working after 15 years on the throne, he could be notably willful and often short-sighted, but he was certainly sincerely patriotic and everlastingly duty-bound. "George, be a king," his mother told him. As the crisis in America grew worse and the opposition in Parliament more stringent, he saw clearly that he must play the part of the patriot king. He had never been a soldier. He had never been to America any more than he had set foot in Scotland or Ireland. But with absolute certainty, he knew what must be done. He would trust Providence and his high sense of duty. America must be made to obey. "I have no doubt but the nation at large sees the conduct in America in its true light," he had written to Prime Minister Lord North, "and I am certain any other conduct but compelling obedience would be ruinous, and therefore no consideration could bring me to swerve from the present path which I have myself in duty bound followed." In the House of Lords in March 1775, when challenged on the chance of Britain ever winning a war in America, Lord Sandwich, First Lord of the Admiralty, had looked incredulous. "Suppose the colonies do abound with men, what does that signify?" he asked. "They are raw, undisciplined, cowardly men." And Lord Sandwich was by no means alone in his opinion. General James Grant, a member of the House of Commons, had boasted with 5,000 British regulars he could march from one end of the American continent to the other, and claimed that was wildly quoted. But in striking contrast, several of the most powerful speakers in Parliament, like the flamboyant Lord Mayor of London, John Wilkes, and the leading Whig intellectual, Edmund Burke, had voiced ardent support for and admiration of the Americans. On March 22nd, in the House of Commons, Burke had delivered in heavy Irish brogue, one of the longest, most brilliant speeches of his career, calling for conciliation with America. Yet for all that, no one in either House, Tory or Whig, denied the supremacy of Parliament in determining what was best for America. Even Edmund Burke, in his celebration speech, had referred repeatedly to our colonies. Convinced that his army at Boston was insufficient, the king had dispatched reinforcements and three of his best major generals, William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. Howe, a member of the Parliament and a Whig, had early told his Nottingham constituents that if it were to come to war in America and he were offered command, he would decline, but duty now called. I was ordered and could not refuse, without incurring the odious name of backwoodsness, to serve my country in distress, he explained. Howe, who had served in America during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it was called, was convinced the insurgents were few in number in comparison to the loyal to the crown. War had come on April 19th, with the first bloodshed in Lexington and Concord near Boston. Then savagely on June 17th at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. The June engagement was commonly known as the Battle of Bunker Hill on both sides of the Atlantic. British troops remained under siege at Boston and were running short on food and supplies. On July 3rd, General George Washington of Virginia had taken command of the American rabble. With 3,000 miles of ocean separating Britain from her American colonies, accounts of such events took a month or more to reach England. By the time the first news of Lexington and Concord arrived, it was the end of May, and Parliament had got its long summer holiday, its members departing London for their country estates. When the outcome at Bunker Hill became known in the last week of July, it only hardened the king's resolve. We must persist, he told Lord North. I know I am doing my duty, and therefore cannot wish to retract. The ever-obliging North suggested that, in view of the situation in America, he might no longer be regarded as a rebellion, but a foreign war, and thus every expedient might be employed. At a hurried meeting at 10 Downing Street on July 26, the cabinet decided to send 2,000 reinforcements to Boston without delay, and to have an army of no fewer than 20,000 regulars in America by the following spring. Bunker Hill was proclaimed by British a major victory, which technically it was, but it was plain truth His Majesty's forces, led by General Howe, had suffered more than 1,000 casualties in an appalling slaughter before gaining the high ground. As was observed pacifically in both London and Boston, a few more of such victories would surely spell ruin for the victors. At summer's end, at a British ship out in Boston, docked at Plymouth bearing 166 and wounded officers and soldiers, most of whom had fought at Bunker Hill and all in great distress, described in vivid published account. A few of the men came on shore when never hardly were seen such objects. Some without legs, others without arms, and their clothes hang on them like a loose morning gown, so much were they fallen away by sickness and want of nourishment. There were, moreover, nearly 60 women and children on board, the widows and children of men who were slain. Some of those, too, exhibited the most shocking spectacle, and even the vessel itself, though very large, was almost intolerable, from the stench arising from the sick and the wounded. The miseries of the troops still besieged in Boston, and those American loyal to the king, who feared for their lives, had abandoned everything to find refuge in town, were also described in letters published in the London papers and correspondence to friends and relatives in London. In the General Evening Post, one soldier portrayed the scene in Boston as nothing but melancholy disease and death. Another, whose letter appeared in the Morning Chronicle Advertiser, described being almost lost for want of fresh provisions. We are entirely blocked up, like birds in a cage. John Singleton Copley, an American portrait painter who left Boston to live in London a year before, read in a letter from his half-brother, Henry Pullum, "It is inconceivable the distress and ruin that this unnatural dispute has caused to its town inhabitants. Almost every shop and store is shut. No business of any kind is going on. I am with the multitude rendered very unhappy. The little I can collect entirely lost. The clothes upon my back and a few dollars in my pocket are now the only property which I have. Despite the war, or more likely because of it, the king remained popular in the country at large and could count on a loyal following of the Parliament. Political philosophy, patriotism, and sense of duty comparable to the king's own figured strongly in both houses. So, too, did the immense patronage of the public money that were his alone to dispense. And if that were not sufficient, there was outright bribery and become standard in a blatantly mercenary system, not of his making, but that he readily employed to get his way. Indeed, bribery, favoritism, and corruption in a great variety of forms were rampant not only in politics, but at every level of society. The clergy and such celebrated observances of the era as John Swift and Tobias Smollett had long since made in it a favorable subject. London, said Smollett, was the devil's drawing room. Samuel Curwen, a Salem loyalist, was dissipation and vicious indulgence everywhere he looked. From the lowest haunts to the most elegant and expressive rendezvous of the noble and polished world. Feeling a touch of homesickness, Curwen thanked God that this was not so back in New England. To much of the press and opposition in Parliament, the American war was, and its handling could not have been more misguided. The Evening Post, the most partisan denunciations, called the war unnatural, unconstitutional, unnecessary, unjust, dangerous, hazardous, and unprofitable. The St. James Chronicle wrote contemporaneously, a foolish, obstinate, and unrelenting king. The Crisis, a vehement newspaper, attacked all the gaudy trappings of royalty and the villainy of the king. What in God's name are ye all about in England? Have you forgotten us? Asked a British officer in a letter from Boston published in London's Morning Chronicle. He wished that all you violent people who favored more rigorous measures in America could be sent over to see for themselves. The vigor would be quickly cooled. God send us peace and a good fireside in old England. The king, meanwhile, had recalled General Thomas Gage, his commander-in-chief at Boston, and in place put the stout-hearted William Howe. When in September an emissary from the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, Richard Penn, arrived in London with an olive branch petition in hand, expressing loyalty to the crown and requesting, in effect, that the king find a way to reconciliation, George III refused to have anything to do with it. Behind the scenes, Lord North had quietly begun negotiations with several German princes of Hesse and Brunswick to hire mercenary troops. And in a confidential note dated on October 15th, the king reassured the prime minister that every means of distressing America would meet his approval. By the crisp, sunny afternoon of October 26th, as George III proclaimed as he proceeded on his way to the opening of Parliament, his popularity had never seemed higher. Opposition to the war, as everyone knew, was stronger and more voracious in London than anywhere in the country. Yet here were crowds gathered greater than any since his ascension to the throne. Further, they appeared to be in the best of spirits, as even the London Public Advertiser took note. Their looks spoke of peace and good humor. There was but little hissing. The king could feel secure in the affection of his people. A boom of cannon saluted His Majesty's arrival at Westminster, and with the traditional welcoming formalities performed, the king assumed his place on the throne at the head of the House of Lords, flanked by the peers in crimson robes. The members of the House of Commons, for whom no seats were provided, remained standing in the rear. The magnitude of the moment was lost on no one. As expected, the king's address would be one of the most important ever delivered by an English monarch. He had a good voice that carried well. The present situation of America, and my constant desire to have your advice, concurrence, and assistance on every important occasion, have determined me to call you thus early together. America was in an open revolt, he declared, and that he denounced the traitors, those who, by gross misrepresentation, labored to inflame his people in America. Theirs was a desperate conspiracy. All the time they had professing loyalty to the parent state and the strongest protestations of loyalty to me, they were preparing for rebellion. They had raised troops and are collecting a naval force. They have seized the public revenue and assumed to themselves legislative, executive, and judicial powers, which they already exercise in the most arbitrary manner. And although many of these unhappy people may still retain their loyalty, the tolerance of violence has been strong enough to compel the acquaintances till a sufficient force shall be appear to support them. Like the Parliament, he had acted thus far in a spirit of moderation, he said, and he was anxious to prevent, if at all possible, the effusion of blood on any subject, and the calamities which are inseparable from the state of war. He hoped his people in America would see the light, and recognize that to be a subject of Great Britain, with all its consequences, is to be the freest member of any society in the known world. Then came a new charge, based on opinions received from his commander at Boston. There must be no more misconceptions about the true intent of those deceiving the unhappy people of America. The rebellious war is manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire. I need not dwell upon the fatal effects of such a plan. The object is too important, the spirit of the British nation too high, the resources with which God hath blessed her too numerous, to give up so many colonies, with such she had planted such great industry, nursed great tenderness, and courage with many commercial advantages, and protected and defended as much with the expense of blood and treasure. Since clearly it was the better part of wisdom to put a speedy end to such disorders, he was increasing both his naval and land forces. Further, he was pleased to inform Parliament he had received friendly offers of foreign assistance. When the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force will be directed shall become sensible in the errors, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy, he pledged, and as evident his good intentions, he would give authority to certain persons to grant pardons upon the spot in America, though beyond this he said no more. In sum, King George III, sovereign of the empire, had declared America in rebellion. He had confirmed that he was committing land and sea forces, as well as an unnamed mercenary force, sufficient to be put an end of the rebellion, and he denounced the leaders of the uprising for having American independence as their true objective, something those leaders themselves had not yet openly declared. Among the many unavoidable ill consequences of this rebellion, he said at last, none affects me more than the extraordinary burden which it must create such faithful subjects. His Majesty appeared before Parliament, had lasted just 20 minutes, and after which, as reported, he returned to St. James's Palace as peaceably as he went. The members of the House of Commons filed out directly to their own chambers, and debate on the King's address commenced brisk and warm in both houses, opposition marshalling the case for conciliation with extraordinary force. In the House of Lords, expression of support was spirited, though comparatively brief. The King was praised for his resolution to uphold the interest and honor of the kingdom, praising him for his decisiveness. We will support your Majesty with our lives and fortunes, vowed Viscount Townshend. Those in opposition had more to say, and spoke at times with pronounced emotion. The measures recommended from the throne, warned the Marquis of Rockingham, were big with the most proportionous and ruinous consequences. The hiring of foreign troops was an alarming and dangerous expedient. Even more deplorable was the prospect of shedding British blood by British hands. Any notion of conquering America was wild and exaggerant, said the Earl of Coventry. The administration was no longer to be trusted, said Lord Littleton bitterly. How comes it that the colonies are charged with playing independence, says the Earl of Shelburne, demanded to know. Who is it that presumes to put an assertion, what shall I call it, my lords, contrary to fact, contrary to evidence? Is it their intention, by thus perpetually sounding independence in the ears of Americans, to lead them to it? As the afternoon light began to fade and the chambers grew dim, the candles of the chandeliers were lit. The one surprise, as the debate continued, was the vehement speech by Duke of Grafton, Augustus Henry Fitzroy, former Prime Minister, who had not previously opposed the administration. Until now, he said, he had concurred with the beliefs in that mode of forceful government dealings in America, most likely matters could be amicably adjusted. But he had been misled, deceived, and made to his ignorance of the real state in America, and fearing that this was no uncommon handicap in Parliament, he wrote proposed to repeal every act concerning America since the Incendiary Stamp Act of 1765. This, I will venture to assert, will answer every end, and nothing less will accomplish any effectual purpose without sending scenes of ruin and destruction, which I cannot think on without utmost grief and horror. The Earl of Dartmouth, Secretary of State for the Colonies, was astonished. How could any noble lord possibly condemn the policies of the administration or withdraw support without at least giving them a fair trial? It was in the Commons that the longer, more turbulent conflict ensued. Of the 20 or so who rose to speak, few held back, attacks on the King, Lord North, the Foreign Ministry in general, and on one point and other times brought the heart and the heat of the debate to the boiling point. There were insults exchanged that would long fester, bombast and hyperbole in abundance, and most when eloquence was brought to bear with a dramatic effect, remarkably even in the Commons. It was Parliament as theatre, and gripping, even if the outcome, like much of theatre, was understood all along. For importantly, it was also well understood and deeply felt that historic chamber was again the seating place of history. That issue of the utmost consequences, truly the fate of the nation, was at stake. The passion of opposing opinion was evident at once, as the youthful John Dyke Ackland of Devonshire declared emphatic support for the King's address. True it was that the task of reducing America to just obedience should not be underestimated, he said, but where the interests of the greater people were concerned, difficulties must be overcome, not yielded to. Ackland, a heart-strong young officer of the army, was ready to serve in America himself, and thus what he said had unusual force, if not perfect historical validity. Recollect the strength, the resources, and above all, the spirit of the British nation, which when roused knows no opposition. Let me remind you of the extensive and successful wars that this country has carried out before on the continent of America was known. Let me turn your attention to that period when you defended this very people from attacks from the most powerful and valiant nation of Europe, France, when your armies gave law and your fleet rode triumphant on every coast. Shall we be told that this other people, the Americans, whose greatness is the work of our own hands and whose insolence arises from our divisions, who had mistaken the leniency of this country for its weakness, and the reluctance to punish for want of a power to vindicate the violated rights of the British subject, shall we be told that such people can resist the powerful efforts of this nation? At about the time these chandeliers were being lighted in the House, John Wilkes, Lord Mayor of London, champion of the people and the homeliest man in Parliament, stood to be heard, and let there be no doubt that he was John Wilkes. I, sirs, speak as firm friend of England and America, but still more to universal liberty and the rights of all mankind. I trust no part of the subject that this vast empire will ever submit to be slaves. Never had England been engaged in contest of such import to her own interest and possession, Wilkes said. We are fighting for the subjugation, the unconditional submission of a country infinitely more extended than our own, of which every day increases the wealth, natural strength, and population. Should we not succeed, we shall be considered as their most implacable enemies, and eternal separation will follow, and the grandeur of the British Empire pass away. The war with our brethren, America, was unjust, fatal, and ruinous to our country, he declared. There was no longer any question whether the Americans would fight, conceded Tory Adam Ferguson, but could anyone doubt the strength of Great Britain to reduce them? And this, he said, must be done quickly and decisively as an act of humanity. Half measures would not do. Half measures could lead only to horrors of civil war. In response, George Johnson, a dashing figure who had once served as governor of West Florida, delivered one of the longest, most vehement declarations of the night, exclaiming, "Every Machiavellian policy is now to be vindicated towards the people of America. Men are to be brought to this black business hoodwinked. They are to be drawn in by degrees till they cannot retreat. We are breaking through all those sacred maxims of our forefathers, giving the alarm to every wise man on the continent of America, that all his rights depend on the will of men whose corruptions are notorious, who regard him as the enemy, and who have no interest in his prosperity. Johnson praised the people of New England for their courage and fortitude. There was wide difference, he said, between the English officer or soldier who merely did his duty and those of New England's army, where every man was thinking of what further service he could perform. No one loved the glorious spirit of freedom could be moved to such a spectacle as Bunker Hill, where an irregular peasantry he had so bravely faced, the gallant Howe leading the finest troops in the world. Who is there that can dismiss all doubts on the justice of a cause which can inspire such conscious rectitude? Alexander Waterburn, Solicitor General, belittled the very idea of standing in the way of the king and called for a full-sail conquest of America. Why then do we hesitate, he asked? Because it is inconsiderably party, inconsistent in their own policies, and always hostile to all governments but their own, endeavor to obstruct our measure and clog our wheels of government. Let us rather second this indignant voice of the nation, which presses in from all quarters upon the sovereign, calling loud and vigorous measures. Sir, we have been too long deaf. We have been too long shown our forbearance and long-suffering. Our thunders must go forth. America must be conquered. As the night wore on, Lord North, the stout, round-shouldered Prime Minister, remained conspicuously silent in his front-bench seat, his large, near-sighted eyes and full cheeks giving him the look, as the wit Horace Walpole said, of a blind trumpeter. North was much liked, moderate, urbane, intelligent. He had made his career in the Commons and, with an affable manner, had acquired few, if any, enemies among his political opponents. When attacked, he took no offense. He could be a remarkably persuasive speaker, but was equally capable, when need be, of remaining silent, even napping a bit. From years of experience, North had also learned to count votes in advance, and he knew now, as did nearly when present, the decided majority of the Commons, like the people at large, stood behind the king. Perhaps the most telling moment of the night of the whole heated session came near midnight, when another army officer, but an older generation, rose to speak. Colonel Isaac Barré was a veteran of the French and Indian War who had come home from the Battle of Quebec badly disfigured. He had been hit on the head by a musket ball that blinded him in one eye and left his face twisted in a permanent sneer. Further, it had been Barré, in a past speech in defense of the Americas, who had first called them Sons of Liberty. The name had taken hold. He had lost one eye, the colonel reminded his listeners, but the one good military eye he had left did not deceive him. The only way to avert this American storm was to reach an accommodation just as soon as possible. Between them, Edmund Burke and young Charles James Fox filled the next several hours. Burke, in customary fashion, took his time. Nearly all that he said, he and others had said before, but he saw no harm in repetition, or any need for hurry. He held the floor for nearly 2 hours, a large part of his speech devoted to the disgrace of British forces cooped up in Boston by those said to be undisciplined rabble. There was no ringing lines from Burke this time, little at all for the newspaper to quote. Possibly he did not wish to outshine Fox, his protege, who spoke next to, and who, at 26, was already a dazzling political star. Born to wealth and position, Fox was an unabashed fop, a dandified macaroni, who at times appeared in high-heeled shoes, each of a different color, and unhappy spent most nights drinking or gambling away his father's fortune at London's best clubs. But his intellect and oratorical gift were second to none. He always spoke spontaneously, never from notes or prepared texts. Fox, it would be observed, would as soon write down what he was doing and going to say as pay a bill before it came due. He attacked immediately, and then, in sneering fashion, called Lord North a blundering pilot who had brought the nation to a terrible impasse. If Edmund Burke had failed to provide a memorable line from the night's efforts, Fox did at once. Lord Chatham King of Prussia, nay, Alexander the Great, never gained more in one campaign than the noble lord has lost. He has lost a whole continent. It was time for a change in administration, time for new policies. The present ministers were enemies of freedom. I cannot consent to this bloody consequence of so silly a contest about so silly an object, conducted in the silliest manner that history or observations had ever furnished an instance of, and from which we are likely to derive nothing but poverty, disgrace, defeat, and ruin. Once Fox finished, North stood at his place and calmly allowed he had no wish to remain a day in office where he was to be judged inactive, inattentive, or inconsiderate. North was not a man enamored with war. He had nothing of the look or temperament of a war leader. Privately, he was not at all sure it would be possible to vanquish the Americas, and he worried about the cost. To General Burgoyne he had written, "I would abandon the contest were I not most intimately convinced of my own conscience that our cause is just and important." George III relied on him, calling him my sheet anchor, and it was, and would remain, North's role to explain and defend the King's administration policies and decisions before the Commons. The intention now, he affirmed, was to send a powerful sea and land force across the Atlantic. But with these forces would go offers of mercy upon proper submission. How proper submission was to be determined, or who was to bear such offers, he did not say. As time would show, however, the real purpose of such peace gestures was to speed up an American surrender. This will show we are in earnest, and we are prepared to punish, but are nevertheless ready to forgive. That is, in my opinion, the most likely means of producing honorable reconciliation. On that note, debate ended. In the House of Lords, where work had wound up at midnight, the opposition to the King's address, and thus all-out war in America, was defeated by a vote of more than 2-1, 69 to 29. In the House of Commons, their impassioned speech notwithstanding, the opposition was defeated by an even greater margin, 278 to 108. By the time the vote in the Commons had concluded, it was 4 in the morning. One of the members of that House of Commons who had refrained from speaking and who felt extremely pleased with the outcome was the gentleman scholar Edward Gibbon. A supporter of Lord North, Gibbon never spoke on any issue, but in private correspondence from his London home, he had been assuring friends that something will be done about America. The powers of the empire would exert to the utmost, he wrote. Irish papists, Hanovers, Canadians, Indians, etc., will all in various shapes be employed. Gibbon, who was then putting the final touches on his first volume and masterpiece, The History and Decline of the Fall of the Roman Empire, now felt more confident about the great course of history in his own time. The conquest of America is a great work, he wrote. Soon after, in early November, King George III appointed a new secretary for the American colonies, Lord George Germain, a choice that left little doubt, if any remained, that King too was considering the conquest of America a serious work to which he was seriously committed. Lord Germain was to replace the Earl of Dartmouth, whose attitude towards the war seemed at times less than wholehearted. He was a proud, intelligent, exceedingly serious man of 60, tall, physically impressive, and, notably unlike the King and Lord North, he was a soldier. He had served in the 7 Years' War in Germany, and with a good reputation until the Battle of Mitten, when, during a cavalry attack, he was accused of being slow to obey orders. He was not charged with cowardice, as his critics like to say. At a court-martial called at his own insistence, he was found guilty only of disobedience. But his military career ended when the court declared him unfit for further service. As a politician in the years since, he had performed diligently, earning a high reputation as an administrator. In his new role, he would direct the main operations of the war and was expected to take a firm hand. To many he seemed the perfect counterpart for the obliging, unassertive North. For the riotous rebels of America, he had no sympathy. What was needed, Germain said, was a decisive blow. The King thought highly of him.
Chapter 2, Rebel in Arms. His Excellency General Washington has arrived amongst us, universally admired. Joy was visible on every countenance. General Nathaniel Greene. "Here we are at loggerheads," wrote the youthful brigadier general from Rhode Island, appraising the situation at Boston in the last days of October 1775. "I wish we had a large stock of gunpowder, that we might annoy the enemy wherever they make appearance. But for want thereof, we are obliged to remain idle spectators, for we cannot get at them, and they are determined not to come to us." At age 33, Nathaniel Greene was the youngest general officer in what constituted the American Army, and by conventional criterion, an improbable choice for such responsibility. He had been a full-time soldier for all of 6 months. Unlike any of the other American generals, he had never served in a campaign, never set foot on a battlefield. He was a foundryman by trade. What he knew of warfare and military command came almost entirely from books. Besides, he was a Quaker, and though of robust physique, a childhood accident had left him with a stiff right leg and a limp. He also suffered from occasional attacks of asthma. But Nathaniel Greene was no ordinary man. He had a quick, inquiring mind and uncommon resolve. He was extremely hard-working, forthright, good-natured, and a born leader. His commitment to the glorious cause of America, as it was called, was total. And if his youth was obvious, the glorious cause was, to a large degree, a young man's cause. The commander-in-chief of the Army, George Washington, was himself only 43. John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, was 39, John Adams 40, Thomas Jefferson 32, younger even than the young Rhode Island general. In such times, many were being cast into roles seemingly beyond their experience or capacities, and Washington had quickly judged Nathaniel Greene to be an object of confidence. He had been born and raised in Kent County, Rhode Island, on a farm by Potawatomi Creek, near the village of Warwick, approximately 60 miles south of Boston. He was the third of the 8 sons of a prominent, industrious Quaker, also named Nathaniel, and the one of all his sons his father counted on most to further the family interests. These included the home farm, a general store, a grist mill, a sawmill, a coasting sloop, and the Greene Forge, all, as was said, in constant and profitable operation. The forge, the most thriving enterprise, which produced anchors and chains and employed scores of men, was one of the leading businesses in the colony, and the Greenes, as a result, had become people of substantial means. The fact that the patriarch owned a sedan chair was taken as the ultimate measure of just how greatly the family had prospered. Because education did not figure prominently in his father's idea of the Quaker way, young Nathaniel had received little schooling. "My father was a man of great piety," he would explain. "He had an excellent understanding and was governed in his conduct by humanity and kind benevolence. But his mind was overshadowed with prejudices against literary accomplishments." With his brothers, Nathaniel had been put to work at an early age, on the farm at first, then at the mills and forge. In time, determined to educate himself, he began reading all he could, guided and encouraged by several learned figures, including the Rhode Island clergyman Ezra Stiles, one of the wisest men of the time, who would later become the president of Yale College. Nathaniel read Caesar and Horace in English translation, Swift, Pope, and Locke's essay concerning human understanding. On visits to Newport and Boston, he began buying books and assembling his own library. Recalling their youth, one of his brothers would describe Nathaniel during lulls in the clamor of the foundry, seated near the great trip hammer, a leather-bound volume of Euclid in one hand, calmly studying. "I lament the want of a liberal education. I feel the mist of ignorance to surround me," he wrote to a like-minded friend. He found he enjoyed expressing himself on paper, and had a penchant in such a correspondence for endless philosophizing on the meaning of life. Yet for all this, no thought of a life or occupation other than what he knew seems to have crossed his mind until the threat of conflict with Great Britain. The description that would come down the generations in the family was of a cheerful, vigorous, thoughtful young man who, like his father, loved a merry jest or tale, who did comic imitations of characters from Tristram Shandy, and relished the company of young ladies, while they, reportedly, never felt lonely where he was. Once, accused by a dancing partner of dancing stiffly because of his bad leg, Nathaniel replied, "Very true, but you see, I dance strong." His defects were perceived to be a certain nervous temperament and susceptibility to poor health, impetuousness, and acute sensitivity to criticism. Full grown, he was a burly figure, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, with the arms and shoulders of a foundryman, and handsome, though an inoculation for smallpox had left a cloudy spot in his right eye. A broad forehead and a full, decided mouth were considered his best features, though a soldier sent to deliver a message to the general would remember his fine blue eyes, which struck me with a considerable degree of awe that I could scarcely deliver my message. In 1770, when Nathaniel was still in his 20s, his father had put him in charge of another family-owned foundry in the neighboring village of Coventry, beside the Pawtuxet River, and on a nearby hill, Nathaniel built a house of his own. Following the death of his father late that year, he took charge of the entire business. By 1774, when he met and married pretty, flirtatious Catherine Littlefield, who was 14 years his junior, he was perceived to be a very remarkable man. It was then, too, with war threatening, that he turned his mind to the military art. Having ample means to buy whatever books he needed, he acquired a number of costly military treatises few could afford. It was a day and age that saw no reason why one could not learn whatever was required, learn virtually anything, by the close study of books, and he was a prime example of such faith. Resolved to become a fighting Quaker, he made himself as knowledgeable on tactics, military science, and leadership as any man in the colony. "The first of all qualities of a general is courage," he read in the Memoirs Concerning the Art of War by Marshal Maurice de Saxe, one of the outstanding commanders of the area. "Without this, the others are of little value since they cannot be used. The second is intelligence, which must be strong and fertile in expedients. The third is health." He took a leading part in organizing a militia unit, the Kentish Guards, only to be told that his stiff leg disqualified him from being an officer. To have it declared publicly that his limp, his halting, would be a blemish on the company was, as he wrote, a mortification beyond any he had known. If unacceptable as an officer, he would willingly serve in the ranks. Shouldering an English musket he had bought at Boston from a British deserter, he marched as a private in company drills for 8 months, until it became obvious that for such a man of such knowledge and ability, it would be best to forget about the limp. Almost overnight, he was given full command of the Rhode Island regiments. Exactly how this came about remains unclear. One of his strongest admirers and mentors was Samuel Ward of Rhode Island, a delegate to the Continental Congress, who was also the uncle of Nathaniel's wife Catherine and presumably used his influence. But that Nathaniel had so willingly marched in the ranks could only have favored him strongly among his fellow volunteers when it came to choosing a commander. General Greene had been at Boston since early May of 1775, at the head of what was called the Rhode Island Army of Observation, applying himself every waking moment, at times sleeping only for a few hours a night. Thus far, no one had found cause to complain about his youth or inexperience. Whatever he lacked in knowledge or experience, he tried to make up for with watchfulness and industry, he would later confide to John Adams. As commander of the Army of Observation, encamped at the American Citadel on Prospect Hill, he tried to take in everything, to appraise and observe the situation as realistically as possible. While the American army controlled the land around Boston, the British, strongly fortified in the city and on Bunker Hill, had control of the sea and could thereby supply their troops and send reinforcements. Only weeks before, in September, reinforcements of 5 regiments had arrived. The task at hand, therefore, seemed clear enough: to confine the king's men in Boston, cut them off from supplies of fresh provisions, and keep them from coming out to gain what one of their generals, Burgoyne, called elbow room. If it ever came to a fight, the American army had scarcely any artillery, and almost no gunpowder. Yet to Greene, the greater weakness and worry was the continuing disorderly state of the army itself. As he wrote to his friend Samuel Ward at the Continental Congress, the prospect was deeply disturbing when you consider how raw and undisciplined the troops are in general, and what warlike preparations are going on in England. At the start of the siege, there had been no American army. Even now, it had no flag or uniforms. Though in some official documents it had been referred to as the Continental Army, there was no clear agreement on what it should be called in actual practice. At first it was referred to as the New England Army, or the Army at Boston. The Continental Congress had appointed George Washington to lead the Army of the United Colonies, but in correspondence with the general, the President of Congress, John Hancock, referred to it only as the troops under your command. Washington, in his formal orders, called them the troops of the United Provinces of North America. Privately, he described them as the raw materials for an army. To the British and those loyalists who had taken refuge in Boston, they were simply the rebels, or the country people, undeserving the words American or Army. General John Burgoyne disdainfully dubbed them a preposterous parade, a rabble in arms. In April, when the call for help first went out after Lexington and Concord, militia and volunteer troops from the other New England colonies had come by the thousands to join forces with the Massachusetts regiments. 1,500 Rhode Islanders led by Nathaniel Greene, 5,000 from Connecticut under the command of Israel Putnam. John Stark's New Hampshire regiment of 1,000 had marched in snow and rain, wet and sloppy, through mud and mire, without food or tents, 75 miles in 3.5 days. The Massachusetts regiments, by far the strongest of the provincial troops, possibly numbered more than 10,000. By June, a sprawling, spontaneous, high-spirited New England army such as had never been seen before was gathered about Boston. Washington, arriving in the first week of July, was told he had 20,000 men, but no one knew for certain. No count had been taken until he made it a first order of business. In fact, there were 16,000, of which fewer than 14,000 were fit for duty. More than 1,500 were sick, another 1,500 absent. In a regular army, such a count could have been accomplished in a matter of hours, Washington noted disapprovingly. As it were, it took 8 days. The enemy's total strength was believed to be 11,000. In reality, there were perhaps 7,000 of the King's men in Boston, or roughly half the number under Washington's command. In a formal address from the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, Washington had been warned not to expect regularity and discipline among the men. The youth of the army had little or no experience with military life, nor were they possessed of the absolute necessity of cleanliness. Beyond that, Washington found them to be men of a decidedly different sort than he expected, and he was not at all pleased. The lay of the land about Boston was also different from anything in the general's military experience. In the simplest terms, as he drew in his own rough map, the setting was one of 3 irregular peninsulas at the head of Boston Harbor, with the peninsula of Boston in the middle, that of Charlestown and Bunker Hill just to the north, and Dorchester close by to the south. But as Boston was connected to the mainland only by a narrow half-mile causeway, or neck, it was more like an island than a peninsula. And thus, by barricading the neck, it had been relatively simple to keep the British bottled up in Boston, just as the British had built their own barricades at the neck to keep the Americans from coming in. The British still held Charleston, which was largely in ruins, and Bunker Hill, which was their citadel and a formidable advantage. Neither side had yet moved to fortify the even higher ground of the Dorchester Peninsula overlooking the harbor. With its numerous green hills falling away to blue water, it was a particularly beautiful part of the world, and especially in summer. Washington thought it very delightful country, and more the pity that it should be a theater of war. A British officer described it as country of the most charming green that delighted eye ever gazed on. Views sketched from the uplands of Charleston by one of the British engineers, Captain Archibald Robertson, show how many broad, open fields and meadows there were, and how modest was the skyline of Boston, its church spires more like those of a country village. They might have been sketches of Arcadia. Had a seagull's eye view been possible, one could have seen the whole American army and its fortifications strung about in a great arc of about 10 miles around the landward side of Boston, from the Mystic River on the northeast to the Roxbury in the south, with British redcoats encamped on the slopes of the Boston Common and many defenses at the neck and within the town and on Bunker Hill. A lofty beacon pole rose from the crest of Beacon Hill, and at the center of the town, the Province House, headquarters for the British command, could be readily identified by its large octagonal cupola and distinctive gold weather vane of an Indian with bow and arrow. In the harbor off Long Wharf were British ships lying at anchor, and 3 were ships of the line, ships of 50 guns or more, while over to the right of the Dorchester Peninsula, at the narrow entrance to the inner harbor on Castle Island, stood the old fort Castle Williams, also occupied by the British. The main concentration of American troops was at Prospect Hill to the north. Others were encamped a few miles farther inland, at the pretty little college town of Cambridge on the Charles River and close to the neck at Roxbury, where the white spire of the Roxbury Meeting House rose from the top of still another prominent hill. At Cambridge, troops were encamped mainly on the Common, though most of the town and the red big buildings of Harvard College had also been taken over. Needing more than his rough sketch of the terrain, Washington had assigned a talented 19-year-old lieutenant, John Trumbull, the son of the governor of Connecticut, to do a series of maps and drawings. For one sketch of the British defenses at the neck, young Trumbull had crawled through high grass almost to the enemy line. For their part, the British had assigned an experienced cartographer, Lieutenant Richard Williams, who, with the help of a small crew, moved his surveyor's transit and brass chains from one vantage point to the next, taking and recording careful sightings. The result was a beautifully delineated, hand-colored map showing the true situation of His Majesty's armies and also those of the rebels. All fortifications were clearly marked, all landmarks neatly labeled, including Mount Whoredom, Boston's red light district. Lieutenant Williams had been appalled to find prostitution so in evidence in what was supposedly the center of Puritanism. There's perhaps no town of its size could turn out more whores than this could, he noted in his journal, and accuracy demanded that this too be shown on the map. Not the least of Washington's problems was that he had command of a siege, yet within his entire army there was not one trained engineer to design and oversee the building of defenses. Still, he ordered larger and stronger defenses built, and the work went forward. Thousands are at work every day, wrote the Reverend William Emerson of Concord after touring the lines. 'Tis surpassing the work that has been done, 'tis incredible. It had been the Reverend Emerson who declared the morning of April 19th, as British regiments advanced on Concord, "Let us stand our ground. If we die, let us die here." With telescopes from Prospect Hill and other vantage points, the Army kept constant watch on the regulars in Boston, just as the regulars kept watch on the Army. It seemed to be the principal employment of both armies to look at each other with spyglasses, wrote the eminent loyalist Peter Oliver, former Chief Justice of the province. Washington knew little about Boston. He had been there only once, and but briefly 20 years before, when he was a young Virginia colonel hoping for advancement in the regular army. And though each side dispatched spies, he put particular emphasis on intelligence from the start, and was willing to pay for it. Indeed, the first large sum entered in his account book was for $333.33, a great deal of money for an unnamed man to go into Boston for the purpose of conveying intelligence of the enemy's movements and designs. The fear that the British were preparing an attack was ever present. We scarcely lie down or rise up, but with expectation that the night or the day must produce some important event, wrote one of Washington's staff. It was in the first week of August, at the end of his first month as commander, when Washington learned how much worse things were than he knew. A report on the supply of gunpowder at hand revealed a total of less than 10,000 pounds, and the situation was not expected to improve soon. Very little gunpowder was produced in the colonies. What supplies there were came mainly by clandestine shipments from Europe to New York and Philadelphia by way of the Dutch island St. Eustatius in the Caribbean. At present, there was powder enough only for about 9 rounds per man. According to one account, Washington was so stunned by the report, he did not utter a word for half an hour. The sprawling American encampments bore little resemblance to the usual military presence. Tents and shelters were mainly patched together concoctions of whatever could be found. Each was a portraiture of the temper and taste of the person that encamps in it, wrote clergyman Emerson. Some are made of boards, some of sailcloth, and some partly of one and partly of the other. Others are made of stone and turf, and others again of brick, and others brush. Some are thrown up in a hurry and look as if they could not help it, mere necessity. Others are curiously wrought with doors and windows. A notable exception was the encampment of Nathaniel Greene's Rhode Islanders. Their proper tents were arranged row on row like the regular camp of the enemy. Everything in the most exact English taste, recorded Emerson approvingly. On the whole, however, he thought the great variety of the camps most picturesque. Others were considerably less charmed. The drunken carousing to be seen, the foul language to be heard were appalling to many, even among the soldiers themselves. Wickedness prevails very much, declared Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins of Ipswich, Massachusetts. A veteran of Bunker Hill and a cobbler by trade, Hodgkins was 32 years old and a man, like many, who had already seen a good deal of trouble and sorrow in his life. His first wife and 4 of their 5 children had all died of disease before the war began. To the remaining child and to his second wife, Sarah Perkins, and the 2 children born of this second marriage, he was a devoted father and husband. Greatly concerned for their welfare, and knowing her concern for him, he wrote to Sarah at every chance. But for now, as he told her, he had no time to be particular about details. A British ship surgeon who used the privileges of his profession to visit some of the rebel camps described roads crowded with carts and wagons hauling mostly provisions, but also he noted inordinate quantities of rum. For without New England rum, a New England army could not be kept together. The rebels, he calculated, were consuming a bottle a day per man. To judge by the diary of an officer with the Connecticut troops at Roxbury, Lieutenant Javis Fitch, who enjoyed a sociable drink, there was considerably more besides plain rum to be had. Drank some grog, he recorded at the close of one day after a stop at a nearby tavern. The gin sling passed very briskly, reads another entry. In the morning I attended the alarm post as usual. Then down at Lieutenant Brewster's kit to drink Ensign Perkins' cherry rum, come back and eat breakfast. He imbibed wine and brandy sling, and on an expedition up into Cambridge town, after a stop to sample some flip, a sweet, potent mixture of liquor, beer, and sugar, he made for another tavern, the Punch Bowl, where there was fiddling and dancing in great plenty. I came home a little before daylight ended. Lieutenant Fitch was one of a number of veterans of the French and Indian War, an easygoing Norwich, Connecticut farmer and the father of 8 children. He enjoyed soldiering and felt so sure his 14-year-old son would too that he had brought the boy along with him. Lieutenant Fitch, an early member of the Sons of Liberty, had been one of the first to answer the call for reinforcements to Boston. Little seemed ever to bother him, although he did object to soldiers dirty as hogs. Much of his free time he spent writing in his diary or to his wife. The sound of British shells overhead was like that of a flock of geese, he wrote, and has done more to exhilarate the spirits of our people than 200 gallons of New England rum. For all its lack of ammunition, tents, and uniforms, the army was amply fed. Fresh produce in abundance and at low prices rolled into the camps all through summer and early fall. The men could count on meat or fish almost every day. Jabez Fitch wrote of enjoying fresh eggs, clams, apples, peaches, and watermelons, a very good breakfast of warm bread and good camp butter with a good dish of coffee, a hearty dinner of pork and cabbage. As yet, no one was complaining of a shortage of food. There had been sickness aplenty from the start, deadly camp fever, which grew worse as the summer went on. Anxious mothers and wives from the surrounding towns and countryside came to nurse the sick and dying. "Your brother Elihu lies very dangerous, sick, and with a dysentery. His life is despaired of," wrote Abigail Adams from nearby Braintree to her husband John in Philadelphia. "Your mother is with him in great anguish." Captain Elihu Adams, a farmer with a wife and 3 children, was one of several hundred who died of illness. Camp fever, or putrid fever, were terms used for the highly infectious, deadly scourges of dysentery, typhus, and typhoid fever, the causes of which were unknown or only partially understood. Dysentery had been the curse of armies since ancient times, as recorded by Herodotus. Typhus, characterized by high fever, severe headaches, and delirium, was carried by lice and fleas, which were a plague amid the army. One soldier recorded seeing a dead body so covered with lice that it was thought the lice alone had killed the man. Typhoid fever, also characterized by a raging fever, red rash, vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating abdominal pain, was caused by the bacillus Salmonella typhosa in contaminated water or food, usually the result of too little separation between sewage and drinking water. And it was not the troops alone who suffered from camp fever. Many of those who came to nurse them were sickened, or carried the disease home, and thus it lay waste to one New England town after another. Of the parishioners of a single church in Danbury, Connecticut, more than 100 would die of camp fever by November. Infectious filth was understood to be the killer. Cleanliness in person, clean cooking utensils, clean water, and unspoiled meat and produce were seen as essential to the prolonged health of the army, and this was among the chief reasons for consistent insistence on discipline and order, and especially with so many thousands camped in such close company. As it was, open latrines were the worst of it, but there was also, as recorded in one orderly book, a great neglect of people repairing to the necessities. Instead, they voided excrement about the fields perniciously. The smell of many camps was vile in the extreme. New England men were also adverse to washing their own clothes, considering that women's work. The British included women in their army, wives and other so-called camp followers, some of whom were prostitutes, who did the washing, but that was not the way with the New Englanders. The troops were in good spirits, but had yet to accept the necessity of order or obedience. Many had volunteered on the condition that they could elect their own officers, and the officers, in turn, were inclined out of laziness or for the sake of their own popularity to let those in the ranks do much what they pleased. Many officers had little or no idea of what they were supposed to do. The officers in general, remembered John Trumbull, were quite as ignorant of military life as the troops. Washington had declared new rules and regulations in force, insisting on discipline, and he made his presence felt by reviewing the defenses on horseback almost daily. "New lords, new laws," observed Pastor Emerson. "New orders from His Excellency are read to the respective regiments every morning after prayers. The strictest government is taking place. Those who broke the rules were subjected to severe punishment or disgrace. They were flogged, or made to ride the wooden horse, or drummed out of camp. One man was whipped for making a disturbance in the time of public worship, another for desertion. Another received 20 stripes for striking an officer, another 30 for damning an officer. But change was maddeningly slow in coming. As scathing as any eyewitness description was that provided by a precocious young New Englander of loyalist inclinations named Benjamin Thompson, who, after being refused a commission by Washington, served in the British Army, later settled in Europe, renamed himself Count Rumford, and ultimately became one of the era's prominent men of science. Washington's army, wrote Thompson, was the most wretchedly clothed and as dirty a set of mortals as ever disgraced the name of soldier. They would rather let their clothes rot upon their backs than be at the trouble of cleaning them themselves. To this nasty way of life, Thompson attributed all the putrid, malignant, and infectious disorders that took such a heavy toll. His loyalist bias notwithstanding, Thompson's portrayal was largely the truth. Such British commanders as Burgoyne and Percy were hardly to be blamed for dismissing Washington's army as peasantry, ragamuffins, or rabble in arms. Except for Greene's Rhode Islanders and a few Connecticut units, they looked more like farmers in from the fields than soldiers. That so many were filthy dirty was perfectly understandable, as so many, when not drilling, spent their days digging trenches, hauling rock, and throwing up great mounds of earth for defense. At one point early in the siege, there were 4,000 men at work on Prospect Hill alone. It was dirty, hard labor, and there was little chance or the means ever to bathe or enjoy such luxury as a change of clothes. Few of the men had what would pass for a uniform. Field officers were all but indistinguishable from the troops they led. Not only were most men unwashed and often unshaven, they were clad in a bewildering variety of this and that, largely whatever they or others at home had been able to throw together before they trudged off to war. One Connecticut woman was reported to have fitted out 5 sons and 11 grandsons. They wore heavy, homespun coats and shirts, those often in tatters from constant wear, breeches of every color and condition, cowhide shoes and moccasins, and on their hats, old, broad-brimmed felt hats, weathered and sweat-stained, beaver hats, farmers' straw hats, or striped bandanas tied sailor fashion. The tricorn, a dressier hat, was more likely to be worn by officers and others of higher status, such as chaplains and doctors. Only here and there might be an old regimental coat be seen, something left over from the French and Indian War. The arms they bore were as various as their costumes, mainly muskets and fowling pieces, which were in effect shotguns. And the more ancient the gun, it seemed, the greater the owner's pride in it. The most common, and by far the most important, was the flintlock musket, a single-shot, smooth-bore, muzzle-loading weapon that threw a lead ball weighing about an ounce and which could inflict terrible damage. The average musket measured 5 feet and weighed about 10 pounds. Though not especially accurate, it could be primed, loaded, fired, and rapidly reloaded and fired again. A good musket man could get off 3 to 4 rounds per minute, or a shot every 15 seconds. The trouble now was that so many of the men, accustomed to firearms since childhood, used them any way they saw fit, almost any time they pleased. To start fires, for example, or blast away at wild geese. In order that officers be distinguished from those in the ranks, Washington directed that major generals wear purple ribbons across their chests and brigadiers pink ribbons. Field officers were to be identified by different colored cockades in their hats. Sergeants were to tie a red cloth to their right shoulders. Washington himself chose to wear a light blue ribbon across his chest, between coat and waistcoat. But then there never was any mistaking the impeccably uniformed, commanding figure of Washington, who looked always as if on parade. The day he officially took command at Cambridge, July 3rd, had been marked by appropriate martial fanfare, a great deal of grandeur, as Lieutenant Hodgkins, the Ipswich cobbler, recorded, 21 drummers, and as many fifers and beating and playing round the parade ground. A young, newly arrived doctor from Barnstable, James Thatcher, assigned to the Army's hospital at Cambridge, described seeing the commander-in-chief for the first time. His Excellency was on horseback, in company with several military gentlemen. It was not difficult to distinguish him from all others. His personal appearance is truly noble and majestic, being tall and well-proportioned. His dress is a blue coat with buff-colored facings, a rich epaulette on each shoulder, buff underdress, and an elegant small sword, a black cockade in his hat. The great majority of the army were farmers and skilled artisans, shoemakers, saddlers, carpenters, wheelwrights, blacksmiths, hoopers, tailors, and ship chandlers. Colonel John Glover's regiment from Marblehead, who were destined to play as important a part as any, were nearly all sailors and fishermen. It was an army of men accustomed to hard work being the common lot. They were familiar with adversity and making do in a harsh climate. Resourceful, handy with tools, they could drive a yoke of oxen or hove up a stump or tie a proper knot as readily as butcher a hog or mend a pair of shoes. They knew from experience, most of them, the hardships and setbacks of life. Preparing for the worst was second nature. Rare was the man who had never seen someone die. To be sure, an appreciable number had no trade. They were drifters, tavern lowlife, some the dregs of society. But by and large, they were good, solid citizens, as worthy people as ever marched out of step, as would be said, married men with families who could depend on them, and with whom they tried to keep contact as best they could. It was the first American army, and an army of everyone, men of every shape and size and makeup, different colors, different nationalities, different ways of talking, and all degrees of physical condition. Many were missing teeth or fingers, pitted by smallpox, or scarred by past wars, or the all-too-common hazards of life and toil in the 18th century. Some were not even men, but smooth-faced boys of 15 or less. One of the oldest, and by far the most popular, was General Israel Putnam, a hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, who at 57 was affectionately known as Old Put. Rough, thick-set, all bones and muscles, and leathery, with flowing gray locks and a head like a cannonball, he was a Pomfret, Connecticut farmer who had survived hair-raising exploits fighting the French and Indians, shipwreck, even a face-to-face encounter with a she-wolf in her den, if the stories were to be believed. Old Put also spoke with a slight lisp and could barely write his name. But, as said, Old Put feared nothing. At the other extreme was little Israel Trask, who was all of 10. Like the son of Lieutenant Jabez Fitch, Israel had volunteered with his father, Lieutenant Jonathan Trask of Marblehead, and served as messenger and cook's helper. John Greenwood, a fifer, one of the more than 500 fifers and drummers in the army, was 16, but small for his age and looked younger. Born and raised in Boston, he had grown up with the Troubles always close to home. A young apprentice living in his house had been one of those killed in the Boston Massacre. Thrilled by the sound of the fifes and drums of the regulars occupying the city, John had somehow acquired an old split fife, upon which, after puttying up the crack, he had learned to play several tunes before being sent to live with an uncle in Falmouth, or Portland, Maine. In May 1775, hearing the news of Lexington and Concord, he had set off on foot with little more than the clothes on his back, his fife protruding from a front pocket. All alone, he walked to Boston, 150 miles, through what was still, much of the route, uninhabited wilderness. Stopping at wayside taverns where troops were gathered, he would bring out the fife and play a tune or two, as he would later recall. They used to ask me where I came from and where I was going to, and when I told them I was going to fight for my country, they were astonished such a little boy, and alone, should have such courage. Thus, by the help of my fife, I lived, as it were, on what is usually called free quarters, nearly the entire route. After reaching the army encampments, he was urged to enlist, with the promise of $8 a month. Later, passing through Cambridge, he heard of the battle raging at Bunker Hill. Wounded men were being laid out on the common. Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. The boy started running along the road that led to the battle, past wagons carrying more casualties and wounded men struggling back to Cambridge on foot. Terrified, he wished he had never enlisted. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. But then he saw a lone soldier coming down the road. An African man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and, his collar being open and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly and the blood running down his back. I asked him if it hurt him much, as he did not seem to mind it. He said no, that he was only to get a plaster put on it and meant to return. You cannot conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war. In response to concerns in Congress over how much of the Army was in fact made up of old men and boys, as well as Africans and Indians, General William Heath reported, "There are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men, and in several regiments some Africans. Such is also the case with the regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Africans and Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both." General John Thomas, who commanded the Massachusetts troops at Roxbury, also responded, "The regiments at Roxbury, the privates, are equal to any I served with in the last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. Our fifers are many of them boys. We have some Negroes, but I look upon them in general equally serviceable with other men, for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave." Like most Southerners, Washington did not want blacks in the Army and would soon issue orders saying that neither Africans, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men were to be enlisted. By year's end, however, with new recruits urgently needed and numbers of free blacks wanting to serve, he would change his mind and in a landmark general order authorize their enlistment. While no contemporary drawings or paintings of individual soldiers have survived, a fair idea of how they looked emerges from the descriptions and notices posted of deserters. One George Reynolds of Rhode Island, as an example, was 5 feet 9.5 inches tall, aged 17, and carried his head something on his right shoulder. Thomas Williams was an immigrant, an old countryman who spoke good English and had a film in his left eye. David Relf, a saucy fellow, was seen wearing a white coat, jacket, and breeches, and ruffled shirt when last seen. "Deserted from Colonel Brewer's regiment and Captain Harvey's company," said a notice in the Essex, Connecticut Gazette, "one Simon Smith of Greenfield, a joiner by trade, a thin, spared fellow, about 5 feet 4 inches, had on a blue coat and black vest, a metal button on his hat, black long hair, black eyes, his voice in the hermaphrodite fashion, the masculine rather predominant. Likewise, Matthias Smith, a small, smart fellow, a saddler by trade, gray-headed, has a younger look in his face, is apt to say, 'I swear, I swear!' and between his words will spit smart. Had on a green coat and an old red greatcoat. He is a right gamester, although he wears something of a sober look. Likewise, John Davy, a long, hump-shouldered fellow, a shoemaker by trade, drawls his words, and for comfortable says comfortable. He had a great coat, thick leather breeches, slim legs, lost some of his 4 teeth. For every full-fledged deserter, there were a half-dozen others inclined to stroll off on any pretext, to do a little clam digging perhaps, or who might vanish for several weeks to see wives and children, help with the harvest at home, or ply their trades for some much-needed hard money. Sometimes they requested a follow. As often, they just up and left, only to come straggling back into camp when it suited. It was not that they had no heart for soldiering or were wanting in spirit. They simply had had little experience with other people telling them what to do every hour of the day. Having volunteered to fight, they failed to see the sense in a lot of fuss over rules and regulations. It was midsummer by the time the first troops from outside New England began showing up. Companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Hardy men, many of them exceeding 6 feet in height, noted Dr. James Thatcher, who was himself short and slight. One Virginia company, led by Captain Daniel Morgan, had marched on a beeline for Boston, covering 600 miles in 3 weeks, or an average of 30 miles a day in the heat of summer. Mostly backwoodsmen of Scots-Irish descent, they wore long fringed hunting shirts, rifle shirts of homespun linen in colors ranging from undyed tan and gray to shades of brown and even black, these tied at the waist with belts carrying tomahawks. At a review, they demonstrated how, with their long-barreled rifles, a frontier weapon made in Pennsylvania and largely unknown in New England, they could hit a mark 7 inches in diameter at a distance of 250 yards, while the ordinary musket was accurate at only 100 yards or so. It was rifling spiraled grooves inside the long barrel that increased the accuracy, and the new man began firing at British sentries with deadly effect, until the British caught on and kept their heads down or stayed out of range. Welcome as they were at first, the riflemen soon proved even more indifferent to discipline than the New Englanders, and obstreperous to the point that Washington began to wish they had never come. Work on defenses went on steadily, the troops toiling with picks and shovels in all weather, sometimes working through the night when the heat of the day was too severe. It was endless, brute labor, but they were remarkably proficient at it, far more so than their British counterparts. As the size and reach of the defenses increased, visitors by the hundreds came to see for themselves. Roads were crowded with spectators to whom the giant ramparts were wondrous works. Nothing on such scale had ever been built by New Englanders before. Breastworks, in many places 17 feet in thickness, trenches wide and deep. Verily, their fortifications appeared to be the works of 7 years. The work parties were fired on from time to time. British and American sentries alike were fired on repeatedly. On August 2nd, as Lieutenant Samuel Bixby of Connecticut recorded in his diary, one of General Washington's riflemen was killed by the regulars today and hung up by the neck. His comrades, seeing this, were much enraged and immediately asked leave of the general to go down and do as they pleased. The riflemen marched immediately and began operations. The regulars fired at them from all sides with cannon and swivels, but the riflemen skulked about and kept up their sharpshooting all day. Many of the regulars fell, but the riflemen only lost 1 man. Both sides staged sporadic night raids on the other's lines, or launched forays to capture hay and livestock from nearby harbor islands. The night of the 30th, the British made a surprise breakout at the Neck, set fire to a tavern, and withdrew back to their defenses. The same night, 300 Americans attacked Lighthouse Island, killed several of the enemy, and took 23 prisoners, with the loss of 1 American soldier. Night was the time for frolicking, remembered John Greenwood, the fifer, as the British were constantly sending bombs at us, and sometimes from 2 to 6 at a time could be seen in the air overhead, looking like moving stars in the heavens. Some early morning British bombardments lasted several hours, the British clearly having no shortage of powder. In one furious cannonade from the British works on Bunker Hill, a rifleman lost a leg, and a company clerk with Nathaniel Greene's Kentish Guards, Augustus Mumford, had his head blown off. Mumford was the first Rhode Island casualty of the war, and the horror of his death moved Nathaniel Greene as had nothing since the siege began. To his wife Katie, who was pregnant with their first child, Greene wrote that he wished she could be spared such news and any fears she may have for his safety. British deserters kept crossing the lines, usually at night and alone, but sometimes 3 or 4 together. Half-starved and disgruntled, they came from both Boston and from the ships in harbor, and nearly always with some bit of news or descriptions of their travails, word of which would spread rapidly through the camps the next day. One night, a lone British light horseman swam his horse across. Another night, 15 men deserted the ships in the harbor. Then days would follow without incident, one day like another. An officer with a company of Pennsylvania riflemen wrote of nothing to do but pick blueberries and play cricket. Nothing important. All quiet, Lieutenant Bixby of Connecticut recorded. On the other side, a British diarist drearily echoed the same refrain, writing nothing extraordinary, day after day. Washington kept expecting the British to attack and failed to understand why they would delay if an end to the rebellion was what they wanted. By the close of summer, with increasing losses from disease, desertions, and absences of one sort or another, his army was in serious decline. Spirits suffered. The patriotic fervor that had sent thousands rushing to the scene in late April and May was hardly evident any longer. It was not just that the army was shrinking. It was due to disappear entirely in a matter of months, the troops having signed on to serve only until the end of the year. The Connecticut enlistments would be up even sooner. It had been the common expectation that the rising of such an armed force as gathered outside Boston would cause the British to think again and reach an accommodation. A short campaign had been anticipated by nearly everyone, including Washington, who had told his wife he would be home by fall. There were still too few tents, still a shortage of blankets and clothing,
and no one had forgotten that winter was on the way. Farmers and soldiers knew about weather. Weather could be the great determiner between failure and success, the great test of one's staying power. In truth, the situation was worse than they realized, and no one perceived this as clearly as Washington. Seeing things as they were, and not as he would wish them to be, was one of his salient strengths. He knew how little money was at hand, and he understood, as did no one else, the difficulties of dealing with Congress. He knew how essential it was to the future effectiveness of the Army to break down regional differences and biases amongst the troops. But at the same time, he struggled to keep up with his mounting contempt for New Englanders. Writing to Lund, Washington, a cousin and his business manager at home at Mount Vernon, he railed against the Yankees as exceedingly nasty and dirty, nothing like what he had expected. He had only contempt for these people. He confided in a letter to Congressman Richard Henry Lee, another fellow Virginian. The heart of the problem was an uncountable kind of stupidity in the lower class of these people, which, believe me, prevails but too generally among the officers, who are nearly of the same kidney with the privates. All such officers desired was to curry favor with the men, and thereby get re-elected. Still, he allowed, if properly led, the Army would undoubtedly fight. And in a letter to General Philip Schuyler, who was in command at Albany, Washington insisted, possibly to rally his own resolve, that they must never lose sight of the goodness of our cause. Difficulties were not insurmountable. Perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages.
On first arriving in Cambridge, Washington had been offered the home of the president of Harvard, Samuel Langdon, for his residence. But finding it too cramped for his needs and those of his staff, his military family, the general moved a few days later to one of the largest, most elegant houses in town, a gray Clamber Georgian mansion about half a mile from the college on the King's Highway. 3 stories tall, with an unobstructed view of the Charles River, it belonged to a wealthy loyalist, John Vassall, who, fearing for his life and the lives of his family, had abandoned the place, fine furnishings and all, to take refuge in Boston. For Washington, who had a fondness for handsome architecture and of river views, the house suited perfectly and would have served his command headquarters through the siege, with his office established in the drawing room off the front hall. The house had become a hive of activity, with people coming and going at all hours. It was there that Washington conferred with his highest-ranking officers, convened his council of war, and, with staff help, coped with the numberless problems of the organization, issued orders, and labored over correspondence, paperwork without end, letters to Congress, appeals to governors of New England states, and the legislature of Massachusetts. There, too, he received or entertained local dignitaries and politicians and their wives, always in elegant fashion, as was both his pleasure and part of his role he felt he must play. And as with everything connected to that role, the uniform, the house, the horses, and equipage, military dress and bearing of his staff, appearances were of great importance. A leader must look and act the part. To judge by surviving household accounts, Virginia hospitality more than lived up to its reputation at Cambridge. Purchases included quantities of beef, lamb, roasted pork, wild duck, geese, turtle, and a variety of fresh fish, of which Washington was especially fond. Plums, peaches, barrels of cider, brandy, and rum by the gallon, and limes by the hundreds. These to fend off scurvy. One entry accounts for payments to a man named Simon Lovett for, quote, carting a load of liquor from Beverly. The domestic staff included a steward, 2 cooks, one of whom was French, a kitchen maid, a washerwoman, 8 others whose duties were not specified, included several slaves, plus a personal tailor for the commander, one Giles Alexander. Washington's body servant, a black slave named William Billy Lee, was a steady companion. Riding with Washington on his rounds of his defenses, Billy Lee became a familiar figure, a large spyglass in a leather case slung over one shoulder. As apparent to all, His Excellency was in the prime of his life. A strapping man of commanding presence, he stood 6 foot 2 inches tall and weighed perhaps 190 pounds. His hair was reddish-brown, his eyes gray-blue, and the bridge of his prominent nose unusually wide. The face was largely unlined, but freckled and sunbeaten and slightly scarred by smallpox. A few defective teeth were apparently there when he smiled. He carried himself like a soldier and sat a horse like a perfect Virginia gentleman. He was the look and bearing of a man accustomed to respect and being obeyed. He was not austere. There was no hint of arrogance. Amiable and modest were words frequently used to describe him. There was a softness in his eyes that people remembered. Yet he had a certain distance in matter that set him from others, or above others. Easy, but not too familiar, he advised his officers. Thus you subject yourself to a want that respect which is necessary to support a proper command. It was a philosophy unfamiliar to most Yankees, who saw nothing inappropriate about a captain shaving one of his soldiers, or a rough-hewn General Putnam standing in line for his rations along with everyone else. Nor was it easy for Putnam and others and the older officers to change their ways. On one occasion, surveying the work on fences by horseback, Putnam paused to ask a soldier to throw a large rock in the path up onto the parapet. "Sir, I am a corporal," the soldier protested. "Oh, I ask your pardon, sir," said the general, who dismounted and threw the rock himself, to the delight of all present. The Philadelphia physician and patriot Benjamin Rush, a staunch admirer, observed that Washington has so much martial dignity in his portment that you would distinguish him to be a general and soldier from among 10,000 people. He is not a king in Europe that would not look like a valet de chambre by his side. A Connecticut delegate to the Continental Congress, Eliphaz Dyer, who had hardly joined in the unanimous decision to make Washington the commander-in-chief, judged him to be no harum-scarum fellow. John Adams, who had put Washington's name in the nomination for command, described him in a letter to his wife Abigail as amiable and brave. "This appointment," wrote Adams, "will have great effect in cementing and securing union of these colonies," and he prophesied that Washington could be one of the most important characters in the world. After meeting the general himself for the first time as a guest at one of his social occasions in Cambridge, Abigail would tell her husband he had hardly said enough. Washington's effect on the troops and young officers was striking. Joy was visible on every countenance, according to Nathaniel Greene, and it seemed as if the spirit of conquest breathed through the whole army. I hope we shall be taught to copy his example and to prefer the love of liberty in this time of public danger to all the soft pleasures of domestic life, and support ourselves with many fortitude among all the dangers and hardships that attend a state of war. Joseph Reed, a young man with a long jaw and somewhat quizzical look in his eyes, was a charming, London-trained Philadelphia lawyer who had been chosen part of the honorary escort when Washington departed Philadelphia for his new command. Reed had intended to ride only as far as New York, but found himself so in awe of the general that he continued on to Cambridge to become Washington's secretary, despite the fact that he had made no provisions for his wife and 3 young children, or for his law practice. As Reed explained, Washington had expressed himself to me in such terms that I thought myself bound by every tie of duty and honor to comply with his request to help him through the sea of difficulties. Few would ever provide a more succinct description of Washington's particular hold on men. Born in Tidewater, Virginia on February 11, 1732 by the old style calendar, George Washington was a great-grandson of John Washington, who had emerged from Northampton, England in 1657. His father, Augustine Washington, was a tobacco planter, also known for his noble appearance and manly proportions. His mother, Mary Bell, was widowed when Washington was 11. Because of his family's reduced circumstances, he had little education, only 7 or 8 years of schooling by private tutor, no training in Latin, Greek, or law, as so many prominent Virginian patriots had, and as those close to him knew, he was self-conscious about that. By steady application, he learned to write in clear, strong hand, and express himself on paper with force and clarity. He learned to dance. Virginians love to dance, and he was no exception. And he learned to comport himself in the elaborate, polite society of day with perfect manners and polish. Of the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company of conversation that he had laboriously copied down as a boy, rule number 1 read, every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect to those who are present. He enjoyed parties, and particularly the company of attractive women. As could be said of British officers, he liked his glass, his game of cards. Though gambling never became an obsession, as it was with so many of his counterparts on the British side. The great teacher for Washington was experience. At age 16, he had set out to make his way in the world as a surveyor's apprentice on an expedition to the wilderness of western Virginia, over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and as years passed, he spent more time in the backcountry beyond the Blue Ridge than all but a few of the Tidewater. In addition, surveying provided highly remunerative. In 1753, at 20, he had been sent by the governor of Virginia to the wilds of western Pennsylvania, to challenge French claims to the Allegheny River Valley, and publication of his diary venue, the Journal of Major George Washington, made his daring and resourcefulness known throughout the colonies and in Europe. A year later, on his first command, an experienced and poor judgment led to his famous encounter with French troops and Indians at Great Meadows in the same remote corner of western Pennsylvania. The small, bloody backwoods incident and first defeated George Washington to set in motion a conflict that ultimately involved much of the world. I heard the bullets whistled. I believe me there in some charming in the sound. He had written a letter later in London Magazine, which could have been taken as the bravado of a callow youth, but as he had found, he was one of those rare few who, under fire, were without fear. As a providential officer fighting for the British Army during General Edward Braddock's defeat in western Pennsylvania, he had shown conspicuous courage under fire and was marked by ability for leadership. If as a young officer he seemed at times fragrantly, unattractively ambitious, he had long since overcome that. In 1759, spurned in his desire for a royal commission, he had retired at age 27 for the life of a Virginia planter, and that same year married Martha Dangridge Curtis of Williamsburg, an attractive, extremely wealthy widow with 2 children to whom he gave full devotion. The children, John Park Curtis and Patsy, were treated quite as though they were his own. Indeed, one of the worst tragedies in Washington's life had been the death of his 17-year-old Patsy of an epileptic fit in 1773. Like other planters of the Tidewater, Washington embraced his life very like that of the old English gentry. English by ancestry, he was in dress and manner, and his favorite pastimes as close to being an English country gentleman as was possible for an American of the day, and intentionally. His handsome green coat with its brass fittings and leather lining had been custom built in England to his specifications. He ordered his clothes from England, and only the finest English wools and linens and the latest fashions would do. He wore English boots, English shoes, and Morocco leather slippers, all made to order for him in England. The books on his shelves, including Military Treatise, were published in London. The very glass in the windows through which he viewed his domain were imported English glass. Only a year before taking command at Cambridge, Washington had commenced an ambitious expansion of his Virginia home, Mount Vernon, which, when completed, would double its size. He was adding a library and building a 2-story dining room or banquet hall, suitable for entertaining on a grand scale. He was a builder by nature. He had a passion for architecture and landscape design, and Mount Vernon was his creation. Everything done to his own ideas and plans. How extremely important all this was to him, and the pleasures he drew from it few people ever understood. He had an abiding dislike for disorder and cared intensely about every detail. Wallpaper, paint color, ceiling ornamentation, and insisted on perfection. He had to be away from the project. Even at the distance of Cambridge, with all the weight on his mind, he worried about things were not being held as he wished at Mount Vernon, and filled pages of instruction for his manager, Lund Washington. I wish you would quicken Lamp, Pyre, and Sears, the carpenters, about the dining room chimney piece, to be executed as mentioned in one of my last letters, as I could wish to have that end of the house complete finished before our return. I wish you had done the end of the new kitchen next garden, and also the old kitchen, with rusticated boards. However, as it is not, I would have the corners done in, so in the matter of our new church. What have you done with the well? Is it all walled up? Have you any accounts of the painter? Second only to his passion for architecture and landscape design was a love for theater, which again was quite characteristic of Virginians. He had seen his first known theatrical production at age 19 on a trip with his older brother to Barbados. It was the first and only time Washington had ever been beyond American shores, and a place where he was strongly attacked by smallpox. Later at Williamsburg, a member of the Virginia legislature, he attended the theater regularly. During his visit to Annapolis, he recorded going to the play 4 nights out of 5. In New York, he had attended the theater 7 times and saw his first production of Hamlet. But all the theatrical productions he had seen, it was Cato, by English author Joseph Addison, the most popular play of the time that Washington loved best. One line in particular he was to think of, or quote frequently in his role as Commander-in-Chief: "'Tis not in mortals to command success, but will do more. Sempronius, we deserve it." Though Washington was often said to be the richest man in America, he probably did not rank among the 10 richest. He was very wealthy nonetheless, and in part because of his marriage to Martha. His wealth was in land, up to 54,000 acres, including some 8,000 acres at Mount Vernon, another 4,000 in the Virginia Dismal Swamp, nearly all which had been acquired for speculation. In addition, he owned more than 100 slaves, another measure of great wealth whose labors made possible his whole way of life. In a popular English novel of the day, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, Tobias Smollett wrote that to be a country gentleman was obliged to keep horses, hounds, carriages, with suitable numbers of servants, and maintain an elegant table for entertaining his neighbors. It could have been described as the life of Mount Vernon, with the difference that the servants were black slaves. Among the Virginia gentry who had taken up fox hunting with exuberance no less than to be found in the country states of England was Washington stood out. Thomas Jefferson considered him the best horseman of his age. That Washington was known to hunt up to 7 hours straight, riding as close to the hounds as possible, leaping fences, and going extremely quick, and always to the end to be in on the kill, was considered not only a measure of his love of the chase and his exceptional physical stamina, but also his uncommon, unrelenting determination. Billy Lee, his body servant, rode with him, rode like the wind by all accounts, and was no less fearless than his master. Found a fox in Mr. Phil Alexander's island, which was lost after 7 hours of chase, Washington recorded in his diary at the end of one winter day in 1772. But he did not give up, as shown in his entry for the following day. Found a fox in the same place again, which was killed at the end of 6 hours. As English sporting writers of the later era would describe fox hunting, the image of war without its guilt and only half its danger. In some years, according to Washington's own records, the days he devoted to fox hunting added up to a month. He had kept precise accounts of exactly how long each chase lasted to the minute. Again, he was a man who loved precision in everything. Stories were told of extraordinary feats of strength. How, for example, Washington had thrown a stone from the bed of a stream to the top of Virginia's famous Natural Bridge, a height of 215 feet. The Philadelphia author Charles Willson Peale, who had been a guest at Mount Vernon in 1772 while painting Washington's portrait, described how he and several other young men were on the lawn throwing an iron ball for sport when Washington appeared and, without bothering to remove his coat, took a turn, throwing it far, very far beyond our utmost limit. Washington's wealth and way of life, like his physique and horsemanship, were of great importance to a large number of men he led among many in Congress. The feeling was that if he, George Washington, who had so much, was willing to risk his all, however daunting the odds, then who were they to equivocate? That he was also serving without pay was widely taken as further evidence of his genuineness to his commitment. There was, to be sure, in those ranks and among the local populace, who had little fondness for Virginian planters and their high and mighty airs, who saw stunning incongruity in cause of liberty being led by a slave master. It was also a matter of record that George Washington had been retired from military life for nearly 15 years, during which he had not even drilled a military militia company. His only prior experience had been in backwoods warfare, a very different kind of warfare, and most notably in the Barter Campaign in 1755, which had been a disaster. He was no means an experienced commander. He never led an army in battle, never commanded anything larger than a regiment, and he never directed a siege. Washington was quite aware of his limitations and formal acceptance of his new command. On June 16, 1775, standing at his place in Congress, he had addressed John Hancock, "I am truly sensible of the high honor done to me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military expertise may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, if Congress desires it, I will enter upon the mountainous duty and exert every power I possess in service of the superior for the glorious cause." He knew he might not succeed, and he gave Congress fair warning. "But lest some unlucky event should happen unfavorably to my reputation, I beg it be remembered that every gentleman in the room, this day I declare with my utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." To his wife Martha he wrote, "Far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but my consciousness of its being too great a trust for my capacities. It has been a kind destiny and has thrown upon me this service." Yet he attended Congress in his splendid blue uniform and with conspicuously signaling the readiness to take command. If he saw the responsibility too great for his ability, it was because he had a realistic idea of how immense that responsibility would be. For such a trust to lead to an undisciplined, poorly armed, volunteered army of farmers and tradesmen against the best trained, best equipped, most formidable military on earth, and with so much riding on the outcome, was in reality more than any man was qualified for. But he knew also that someone had to take command, and however impossible the task of the odds, he knew he was better suited than any other in Congress might have in mind. Without question, Congress had made the right choice, and not the least of reasons was political. As a Virginian, Washington represented the richest, most populous of the 13 colonies. He had himself years of political experience in Virginia, legislator, and as a member of the Continental Congress. It was as one of them that the members of Congress knew him best and respected him, not as a general. He knew the ways of politics and factious politicians. He understood how the system worked. For all the delays and frustrations, however severe the test of patience he was to suffer in his dealings with them and the system, he had never forgot that Congress held ultimate power, that he, the commander-in-chief, was a servant of some 56 delegates who, in far-off Philadelphia, unlike Parliament, met in secrecy. And that is what we're going to end off on today. You doubtlessly know at least some of the story already, but if you want to rehear this little telling, there are several copies of this in multiple libraries across our system.
And remember, we are accepting suggestions for readings for next year. Please email us at theawayteam@mccpl.lib.al.us. Thank you. Enjoy yourself.
And keep reading.